For at least a century, people have argued over the same question. Is socialism good or bad for a country's economy? That debate has sparked revolutions that became modern empires and even triggered wars in the name of such ideology. Now, a new study published in the Journal of Comparative Economics offers an academic and statistical answer to that question. The paper, The Growth Consequences of Socialism, analyzed data from almost 200 countries spanning 1950 to 2020, using rigorous methodology to estimate what actually happens to economic growth when a country adopts the planned economy of the socialist model. The study was authored by Andreas Berg of Lund University and the Research Institute of Industrial Economics in Sweden, Christian Bjornskov of Aarhus University in Denmark, and Lydia Koba of Mendel University in Brno, Czech Republic. Before any analysis, the authors defined precisely what they mean by socialism. Drawing on thinkers such as Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, they describe socialism as a socio-economic model based on state ownership of the means of production, combined with a central command economic plan. The focus is on orthodox, Marxist-inspired socialism, the kind that nationalizes production and replaces the market with centralized planning. This type of planned economy was established not only in the Soviet Union in the 1920s and Eastern Europe in the late 1940s, but also across numerous African, Asian, and Latin American countries between the 1950s and the 1980s. The paper begins from an uncomfortable observation. Despite all the historical evidence, very few studies have systematically evaluated the degree to which socialism actually affects a country's economic growth. In fact, voices in recent political debates have gone so far as to claim that these effects are negligible or even non-existent. Meanwhile, political interest in socialism has been rising again. At the peak of global socialism in 1980, more than 1.5 billion people out of a world population of approximately 4.4 billion lived in socialist countries. And despite the collapse of the Soviet Union, there are clear signs of renewed interest in socialism and planned economies reflected in the relative success of politicians such as AOC and Zoran Mamdani in the US, Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico, or the Podemos party in Spain. It is in this context that the authors set out to fill this gap with solid data and rigorous methodology. Their research strategy combines two complementary methods. The first is a neighboring country comparison, pairs of geographically close and historically similar nations where one adopted socialism and the other did not. The second is a panel data analysis, a statistical methodology that examines data organized across two dimensions simultaneously, spatial units such as countries and time periods, observed over multiple years. For these comparisons, the authors use the Pan World Tables version 10, from which they draw data on GDP per capita adjusted for purchasing power parity and GDP per full-time worker, as well as data on investment rates, final government expenditure, trade volumes as a percentage of GDP, and population size. The second key variable comes from an updated version of the Democracy and Dictatorship dataset, covering 192 sovereign countries annually from 1950 to 2020. The primary focus is on the 22 developing countries that made the decisive transition to planned socialist economies after gaining independence. These countries include Tanzania, Zambia, Vietnam, Sudan, and Venezuela. But before we continue, take 5 seconds to subscribe to our channel and like this video. It helps us keep on producing more content for you. The first layer of evidence comes from the neighboring country comparisons, and the numbers reveal a lot. Taiwan's annual growth rate between 1950 and 1990 averaged 2.7 percentage points higher than China's. Austria's was 1.6 percentage points higher than Czechoslovakia's, and Greece's was 0.7 percentage points higher than Yugoslavia's, even accounting for Greece's considerable political instability, including coups and a period of military dictatorship. These comparisons are particularly powerful because they control for geographic location, regional context, and historical period. The countries analyzed share similar cultural and historical origins, yet followed radically different economic trajectories from the moment one of them adopted centralized planning. Beyond the neighboring comparisons, the panel data analysis reinforces the same conclusion with even greater statistical robustness. The results consistently point to a drop of approximately 2 percentage points in annual growth rates during the first decade following the implementation of socialism. Fixed effect estimates indicate that developing countries that transition to socialism lose on average approximately 2 to 2.5 percentage points of annual growth compared to similar countries that did not. 2 percentage points may sound modest. However, the compounded effect over decades is devastating for human welfare. To give that concrete scale, the authors offer the following illustration. Imagine two countries that start from the same point, with identical GDP per capita. One adopts socialism and grows at 1% per year. The other, without socialism, grows at 3%. After 10 years, the gap already exceeds $2,000 per person in income. After 20 years, the difference climbs to nearly $6,000 per capita. As the study notes, the losses generated by socialism are qualitatively similar to those experienced by the Central and Eastern European countries that implemented socialist economies after World War II, and they imply substantial losses in human welfare over a typical socialist period of roughly 15 years in a developing country. This is the cost of socialism in practical terms, not a sudden catastrophe, but a continuous, quiet erosion of prosperity. The paper explains that the problem with socialism stems primarily from weak or absent incentives for work and investment, combined with the suppression of the price coordination mechanism. To these are added weakened incentives for innovation and entrepreneurship. The Austrian school critique reinforces this. The central problem with socialist planning is the waste of knowledge and creativity inherent in centralized decision-making. By concentrating production decisions in the hands of the state, the price mechanism, essential for signaling scarcity and demand, is destroyed. The paper details how the absence of entrepreneurial incentives transformed previously promising nations into stagnant bureaucratic structures. Without the pressure of competition and without the reward of innovation, these countries began to diverge sharply from market economies. Where creativity and efficiency seeking once existed, a productive paralysis set in, condemning the socialist bloc to an enormous and widening technological gap. The rigorous statistical analysis demonstrates that the development gap between free market economies and socialist nations was the result of structural inefficiency. The study shows that while capitalist economies optimize capital allocation through private ownership, the socialist model suffered from misallocated investment and the squandering of human capital. The result was a chronic shortage of basic consumer goods, in stark contrast to bloated heavy industries that produced vast quantities of steel, yet were incapable of providing basic welfare to their own populations. The consequences of socialism extended well beyond the period of the regimes themselves. The study also highlights that the exit cost was enormous. When the nations of the former Soviet bloc returned to market economies after 1989, they inherited obsolete infrastructure and degraded institutions. The accumulated per capita income gap during the socialist years left a scar that proved difficult to erase, even after decades of reform. The generational impact on economic mentality and institutional trust remains an obstacle. Now, the economic data is unambiguous. The path of total state control produced a setback that demanded sacrifices across multiple generations to be, at least partially, reversed. This is the evidence of none other than 7 decades of data. The study is especially relevant today, as the debate over socialism has returned to the center of politics in multiple countries. For developing nations seeking growth and poverty reduction, the historical record of the 22 countries analyzed offers a warning that cannot be easily dismissed. But to really understand the extent to which countries suffered under socialism, you ought to take a deeper look into history. In the beginning of the 20th century, ideas developed by two Germans that go by the name of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels ignited revolutions that gave birth to a real-life empire that enforced socialism as supreme rule from Siberia to half of continental Europe. Their side of the story is of a paradise on earth level of so-called equality. But we dare to ask, was it really? We traveled to what was known before as the Soviet Union and all over the world to understand communism, socialism, and most importantly, the truth behind them and their power project. The result of our quest was The History of Communism, a documentary that will deliver to your phone screen and TV the raw truth of these revolutionary ideas. Unlock access now to discover the real face of communism by clicking the link in the description or scanning the QR code on the screen. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and drop a comment below letting us know your thoughts. Plus, turn on the notifications so you know as soon as we drop a new video. This is important for us, and it helps us deliver the best content to your feed. See you in our next 10-minute brief.